What I also want to just actually acknowledge as well is this talk and how I'm delivering it as well is I myself can't profess to be an expert on Sarah Parker Remond, in that that's not something I've kind of spent a huge amount of my own academic life looking into. It's someone who I've come across and discovered, as I said, through Annabelle and Ellis introducing to me them in the past 2 years that I've been working here as a librarian. And so my interest from that has been looking through our archive records, some of which I'll be sharing with you today, but also a book that has been written about Sarah Parker Remond by the academic Sirpa Salinas, who's a Finnish academic who specialises in race and gender in the transatlantic context. And so a lot of what I'll be talking about today is actually taken from some of their research, what we've got in the archives as well, and then some other bits and pieces that we've pulled together to tell you Sarah Parker Remond's life story. So in that sense, with the archives unfortunately being closed at the moment because of the current situation, I think this is a great opportunity to be sharing this remarkable woman's life story with you and being able to showcase some of the collections that we do have, even if you are unfortunately unable to visit them themselves at the moment. So in terms of this talk then, I'm actually going to do a little bit of a kind of like This Is Your Life, if you're familiar with that kind of TV show and the format of it, of going through a number of key events within Sarah Parker Remond's life, taking some quotes and anecdotes and reflections of her own and other people's to kind of string together her life story, her achievements, and some of the things that she did do and observed and said and witnessed throughout her life. So Sarah Parker Remond herself was born in Salem, Massachusetts in 1826. She was, from her own record, she said, the youngest of one of 10 children. However, from certain archive records that do exist over in Massachusetts, such as the records of births and deaths, it could actually have been either 8 or 11 siblings, depending on the exact source you look at. What it is apparent may have occurred is that prior to Sarah being born, there was a number of siblings that may have passed away very early on in life that she was potentially unaware of, but are actually recorded within the death and births records within Massachusetts. And so there's a little bit of uncertainty actually how many brothers and sisters she did actually have. Her parents were Nancy and John Remond, who were born free, as was Sarah Parker Remond herself. It's believed that their freedom came about through her paternal grandfather, who actually fought in the American War of Independence, and through that it's believed was granted his freedom, moved up to Massachusetts, and then started a family, of which John and then married to Nancy, and then obviously Sarah was a result of that union. I've got the quote at the bottom here, which is not a kind of a directly attributable quote to an individual, but the concept of separate but equal in terms of the context of what American society and life was at the time. You may be familiar to some extent with the Jim Crow laws, which is a kind of general description of laws or just societal ways of operating in which the concept was that there was racial segregation where it was separate but equal. The quote marks are there because the reality is, yes, while in some instances the races were kept separate, they most certainly were not equal. And this is something that Sarah Parker Remond through her early life very much did experience. In Massachusetts itself at the time, into the mid-1800s, there weren't actually really any formalised laws around segregation, but it was something that was very much practised and was in effect within the state. And there's a kind of number of examples from her early life and into her teens which illustrate this in terms of how her family was and their standing within the community, but then how they were actually treated in some other instances. Now, both her parents, Nancy and John Remond, were active abolitionists themselves, and at different points ran a range of very successful businesses, from hairdressing to actually a catering business as well. And this is where one of the instances of this whole idea of separate but equal comes in that her father actually did cater for an event organised by the then President Andrew Jackson, which also hosted the Marquis de Lafayette, who was very instrumental in the American War of Independence. And so you've got this instance where he's brought in as the primary caterer for a very prestigious event And it kind of illustrates, first of all, actually how successful their businesses were and the standing and regard they were held in, and how they were brought in, that they were happy to be the caterers for that kind of event. The flip side of that, though, is that despite the family actually being very respectable, quite monetarily comfortable, they weren't treated as such in society. And there's an instance when Sarah and her sister were quite young, they attempted to attend the opera, where they'd actually purchased box tickets. So there's perhaps a reflection of the cost that would have gone into that. But the management refused them access based on the colour of their skin, and then forcibly ejected them from the building, which did actually injure Sarah's arm and also cause damage to the dress she was wearing. And so you've got this kind of juxtaposition of her family are kind of brought in, that they're happy for them to be caterers at prestigious events, but actually just trying to live their life on an equal footing, they kind of encounter this prejudice and discrimination. In terms of this event in particular with the Opera House, there's something quite telling of how this starts to inform Sarah's own thinking around abolition, slavery, equality, and confronting prejudice, because what she actually did was she took the manager of the Opera House to court for battery, and reportedly from the court proceedings was awarded $500 from this, which is the equivalent of about $17,500 today. Now you might think that that was a victory for equality, but actually the court ruling was she got the payment because the venue wasn't advertised as a segregated venue. It wasn't anything to do with actually the injury caused, it was because of false advertising. And so the inference being actually that if the venue had been advertised as a segregated event, Sarah's treatment in that respect as being forcibly ejected would have been entirely acceptable. And this is a kind of event that does start to inform Sarah's thinking. This happened when she was a teenager, that while her family in their community standing are quite well respected within some circles, there's not this ability to live their life on an equal footing with white people in the community as well. And there are certain little other instances of prejudice that she does encounter as well, and education is a very big area where this does happen as well. One of the things that Sarah Parker Remond wrote herself in a self-titled essay, Remond, was, "I found the most exquisite pleasure in reading, and, as we had no library, I read every book which came my way, and like Oliver Twist, I longed for more." And there's an interesting kind of thing on this, because Sarah was kind of home taught and self-educated up until the age of 11. She said she had no access to a library, and what she was reliant on was really a community within the black community of Massachusetts and New England, of societies, groups, and discussion forums for people who are interested in abolition, equal rights, and women's suffrage as well, to come together, and where they would share books, they would share pamphlets, they would share newspapers, and from this Sarah would be able to have access to all this information, which is again informing her thinking, impressing on her the kind of ideas that you can then see when she does begin her own speaking tour. Now, she was self-taught largely in the family home up until the age of 11, and at that point she did then enter and pass an entrance exam for a local private school in Salem, Massachusetts. And this was perhaps a reflection of actually how naturally intelligent Sarah was, that having come from a self-taught background, she was able to pass this entrance exam. However, within less than a week, she was expelled from the school along with her sister due to the colour of her skin, and the local education board said that they will be supporting setting up a separate school for black only people. And this is an event that really does stick in her mind, and this was again something where you can see how this event and the injustice of it does carry through to her later life and some of the things she does say and talk about in her speeches. In actually talking about this event itself and reflecting upon it later, she said, "I thought of the great injustice practiced upon me and longed for some power to help me crush those who thus robbed me of my personal rights." And even further from that, she said, "Years have elapsed since this occurred, but the memory of it is as fresh as ever in my mind, engraved on my heart." And this is something which really does, you can tell from the quotes here, stick with her in later life. And in terms of the speaking tours that she does go on to do in the US and later the UK, that yes, the primary focus was abolition of slavery, but there's also a very strong theme of equality within education for black people and women as well. And this is an event in her life, this being kicked out, well, not kicked out, so expelled from the school at the age of 11 along with her sister, really does jar with her. And it's something as well that there's a quote from her teacher who was there for the week, said that this was all done despite Sarah being one of the brightest students that they actually had at the school. There was, in attempts to get education in other areas such as public schools, she was met with the same prejudice. And eventually she ended up attending a school in New England that was set up by a local black community for the sole purpose of educating black people, that they'd recognised that there wasn't this provision, that the state wasn't going to fairly provide it, and so they took the kind of ownership of them within themselves to provide this education service. And this kind of community element is something that really does inform and be a big part of Sarah's early life. There's a heavy involvement with the family and herself within church networks, as I've mentioned before, speaking groups, abolitionist groups, and general kind of intellectual discussion groups as well around politics, women's suffrage, equality. And in terms of the kind of wider context of this is America as a relatively new country. There's the beginnings of the rumblings of the Civil War coming up as well. And so it's a real hotbed of political discourse which Sarah and her family are increasingly involved in. Her parental influence at this point is a very, very big thing as well. And within a number of her writings, this is quite clearly reflected. Her mother in particular is a large focus of Sarah's writings and reflections, in that there's the quote that we've got here: "We were all trained to habits of industry, with a thorough knowledge of those domestic duties which particularly mark the genuine New England woman. We were taught to knit and sew and to cook every article of food placed upon the table. The most trifling affair was obliged to be well done. Her aim seemed to be to guard and at the same time strengthen her children, not only for the trials and duties of life, but also to enable them to meet the terrible pressure which prejudice against colour would force upon them." So this is Sarah talking about her mother and her upbringing and the kind of attitudes and ethos that was instilled within her. Now the superficial reading, and this is where Sir Silenus draws quite an interesting interpretation of this, is that you could read this as a superficial reading, and with a modern lens even, of in this perhaps is training Sarah or presenting Sarah in a very traditional, very woman, homekeeping role. But there's a deeper layer to this that Sir Silenus kind of draws on and says that at the time there's a prejudice against black women in that they're not presented as being maternal, they're not presented as being good wives or good homekeepers. And I think there's an element of this then that's drawn out from the research done in the book, showing that Sarah's mother was very mindful of this attitude and was very keen to impress upon Sarah that you've almost got to aim for this perfection. You've got to aim for this particular impression or way that you present yourselves that is irreproachable, it's impeachable, that there can't be criticism drawn to it. You are the paragon of femininity in many senses, that you're able to do everything. The second kind of layer of this as well is, and it's something that is drawn through some of Sarah's own writings, is that there was a desire for them to be, as a family, to be independent, to not be reliant on others, to not require other people to support them and help them, that they could have this self-determination, this ownership of their own lives, their own skills, their own intelligence and education than others. And so there's this quite clear inference from her parents that does come through with Sarah as well in some of her later things that she does do. And I think the fact that Sarah very much focuses on self-improvement and this idea of being independent and doing things for herself and not deferring to others, but to speak her own mind on her own terms, really could be drawn and linked to this early upbringing and life. There is as well this quote here that was written in a letter to an unnamed friend that says, "While our mother never excused those who unjustly persecuted those whose only crime was a dark complexion, her discipline taught us to gather strength from our own souls, and we felt the full force of the fact that to be black was no crime." A very common reoccurring theme through Sarah Parker Remond is and rightly so, an unapologetic attitude to the colour of her skin, that is not a factor that should be any sort of judgment or criteria that someone is judged upon. And this comes through in a number of her other speeches earlier, that in a broad sense you could almost say it as in like, you're not judging someone by the colour of their skin but the content of their character. And that is something that is very much drawn through, yes, in her abolitionist talks, but also in the kind of women's education as well, that you shouldn't be judged as a woman and then your access to education or suffrage. You should be judged on your own merits, your own achievements. Now, interestingly, within a lot of Sarah's own reflections, her father isn't actually talked about all that much. Now, there's no kind of suggestion of any sort of poor relationship or anything, but what Silenus does kind of interpret this as is that Sarah's very keen to promote the kind of feminist support and a mindset in that sense of giving credit to her mother where it was due for the kind of ethos, the upbringing, the attitudes that were instilled upon her came from her mother. So that isn't necessarily to detract from the role of her father, from what all the records suggest was a very harmonious relationship. It's more that Sarah deliberately, in this sense, really wanted to focus on the influence that her mother had on her own upbringing and her own kind of ethos going forward as well. Now, at a particularly young age, Sarah did become involved in public speaking, and we think it's perhaps around 15, 16 years old that she does become involved in what you would call like the speaking circuit in America, talking about abolition. Her parents, as I've already said, were involved in the movement, and a number of her other brothers and sisters were involved in the movement as well, speaking at events and at campaigns. This comment here from a letter written by Samuel J. May, who was a white abolitionist reformer, spoke out in favour of women's rights, and in his own role gave a lot of platforms for speakers of colour to come in and talk about abolition, wrote this about Sarah in a letter in around 1858. He said, "Sarah is quite a pleasing speaker, and the novelty of a young coloured woman appearing as a speaker will be likely to be attractive." And this is a very interesting comment, as in the gentleman Samuel J. May was obviously supportive of the abolitionist movement, but there's a kind of optics that he's putting onto this and Sarah's role within this movement of, in his mind, perhaps how it might be leveraged or taken advantage of. And it's something as well that is kind of seen through her whole life, that being a woman of colour speaking on the abolitionist movement, in favour of the abolitionist movement, was a bit of a novelty. There is within the kind of records of history an element of a white narrative, you could argue, around how certain abolitionist movements came about, especially in the UK with the Quakers and William Wilberforce. But within the actual movement itself, there was a lot of vocal black people on the subject, Sarah included, Frederick Douglass amongst others. And this whole idea then is almost a novelty that will draw attention to the cause. It will bring people to meetings. It will get people to listen to it because of her being a coloured woman and the novelty associated with that. But there is as well that, oops, sorry, I'm skipping my slides, that she was in her own right an eloquent and accomplished speaker. A lot of records from the time, and ones that we have as well from newspaper articles when she does come to the UK, do demonstrate her skills as an orator, that she did hold crowds' attention. And to an extent as well, and this comes out from a couple of other quotes I'll share with you in a bit, that she leveraged this idea of her femininity and womanhood to her own advantage, that she was acutely aware of it within the context of what society was at the time, of how she could use her position to leverage and gain attention for the cause that she wanted to promote. Now, in America, she toured a huge amount. She toured northern states. She even went into southern states as well, where there was codified laws around segregation and very hostile audiences. And I think this kind of shows, like, thinking back to the quote from, she said of her mother, that to be black wasn't a crime, that she was unashamed and unafraid to go into these arenas and to be challenging the prejudice that she was faced with. As she started doing the abolitionist talks and the touring around the US, she also began to promote literacy in black communities and access to fair education. And I think this again draws back to her earlier experiences where she was, for her own mind, denied access to this fair education that she had achieved off her own intellect passing the exams. And so she began to campaign for that as well. And interestingly, it's actually, in this sense, talking about women's rights, talking about access to education and suffrage as well, that causes probably some of the biggest problems for her when she is on this speaking tour in the United States. That yes, there was the prejudice because of the colour of her skin, but actually some of the most violent or difficult audiences were actually when she was speaking out on women's rights. And women's rights as well, there is evidence of it causing a little bit of a schism within the kind of abolitionist movement as well, as in this separation of, well, abolition of slavery, but also women's suffrage, as in for some people it was very much wedded to each other, as in any sort of oppression is oppression, and so you fight it on all fronts, versus then the idea that they were separate issues, and the whole idea of then like male and female typical gender roles, which you can say, like for Sarah going on these speaking tours, she very much was challenging and going against social norms of the time. There was an incident before Sarah had gone on speaking tour herself that kind of illustrated this, that in 1938 protesters did burn down the meeting hall of the Anti-Slavery Convention of American Women in Philadelphia, and this was actually because of the gender mixing of the speakers more so than the actual topic of anti-slavery, that there was more of an issue that there was women speakers on the podium delivering speeches than actually the topic itself. And this is kind of an interesting thing that you can draw through in terms of her experiences in America, and then also some of her experiences later on in the UK as well. Through these speaking tours, Sarah very, very quickly gained a very good reputation and did gain press coverage and fame through this. She became quite a recognisable name, and people did want to come and see and hear her speaking. And so there's an idea at this point then that with what quite a number of abolitionist speakers were doing was to take the message abroad, to go across to Europe, which was seen as kind of like the old country and from an American perspective, and to try and gain support there, raise money and build interest to put pressure on the Americans to abolish slavery. So what Sarah did at this point then was to apply for a passport, and then she did plan to go across and travel to the UK. And before she did go, she wrote to a friend, Abby Kelly Foster, saying, "I dread starting for many reasons. I do not fear the wind nor the waves, but I know that no matter how I go, the spirit of prejudice will meet me." And I think this is a quote, and this is again what Leurs draws out as an interpretation, is that her whole life up to this point had been one of encountering prejudice in education, in just society, and just going about what she would perceive as wanting to live a normal life. And that was her whole kind of informed experience at that point, that simply because of the colour of her skin, she'll be prejudged and be unable to access certain things on an equal footing. And so this is something that she has in her mind, and she's very concerned about going forwards. The fact as well that at the time it was very uncommon for women to travel unaccompanied, and she went unaccompanied, because on January the 12th, 1858, she sails across. I think it takes about 16 days and arrives at Liverpool docks. Now, as I said, she's travelling for several reasons here. First of all, she's built up this fame, she's built up this reputation in America that she now wants to take across to the UK to build upon further and capitalise upon. She wants to continue speaking about abolition and the horrors of slavery, but importantly, she wants to raise money as well. She wants to raise money that she can send back home to support the abolitionist movement, but importantly as well, she talks about wanting to help support the building of churches and schools in black communities. And so again, reflecting on her earlier experiences, part of her agenda with this is to try and readdress some of the prejudice that she found and encountered in her early life, to try and address that and balance it out so that others wouldn't in the future. There's also a quote that she has that she felt she was in need of a good English education. And again, there's a kind of dual aspect to this as well, in that the perception of English education at the time, that to be taken seriously, perhaps intellectually or academically, you need to have that English education, and again something that she felt she was denied back in America. But also there's again this kind of optics on it, that if she's got this education, it enhances her reputation further. Now, when she arrived in the UK, she met a British abolitionist, William Robson, and this person essentially was actually a gateway to, and I'll quote here again, the highest and selectest order of social and literary society. And this is a very interesting moment for Sarah Parker Remond, because previously, where she's battled physically just to try and have access to a box seat at the opera, once she arrives in Britain, she's invited into some of the highest stratas of British society at the time. She's welcomed into it. She's met in a very different manner from perhaps what she was expecting or what she was used to. And there's a quote later on that I'll share with you that kind of shows her impressions and mindset of how she was welcomed in the UK. Now, one of the reasons, as I said, when she came to the UK was that she was looking for this good English education, and this is where her involvement and association with Bedford College does come in. She enrolled in October 1859, and while she was enrolled there for the 2 years, lived with the college's founder, Elizabeth Jesser Reed. We believe that Sarah Parker Remond was the first black student as well to be enrolled at Bedford College, so there's something we're not 100% able to verify, but from what we understand, that is the fact of it. And what I've got here then is actually, I just want to go in a little bit of a kind of summary of Bedford College and some of the Bedford New College, and some of the history around that and the context of what she was stepping into. Elizabeth Jesser Reed herself, and we know this from some of her own letters and speech, like talks she's gave, campaigned for the abolition of slavery, obviously was very supportive of women's suffrage and also equal access to women's rights, in that Bedford New College was the first higher education institute for women set up and was operating out of the address 47 Bedford Square. And so it's these kind of very humble beginnings of the college, where they did literally rent a house at Bedford Square in terms of then operating Bedford New College at this point. And this is the kind of situation then that Sarah does step into, this small women's institute of higher learning, the first one in the UK, and this idea of now being able to achieve and get a good English education. So what we've got at this point as well is a number of other incidents that do happen as well, and a number of things that do, you can see, start to inform her thinking, some of her mindsets, and some of the way she starts speaking and relating to a UK audience. Now, one of the things as well from this when she was studying is, sorry, I'm just skipping a couple of slides, is from her student record, the actual subjects that she did study. And what I've got on the slide here is a photograph of the actual enrolment record for Sarah Parker Remond here. I've highlighted it for you. Promise you we've not highlighted it in the actual record itself, which shows her name there enrolled at the college. We can see here from the student record as well the subjects that she was enrolled in and was taking, and there's a little comment at the bottom that I'll go into a bit further in a moment. But at this point of time, because of requirements stipulated by the Committee of Education, you had to study between 5 to 7 subjects in order to obtain a degree. And so we can actually see here from each of the terms, we've got her studying modern history, English literature, French, Latin, elocution, vocal music, mathematics and geography as well, amongst I think a couple of others within that ancient history as well. Sorry if I'm not sure if I mentioned that. So there's a whole range of subjects here. And interesting as well, studying the classics and Latin was something that traditionally wasn't done by, well, in fact, women's education wasn't a tradition obviously in the UK at this point, but studying those particular subjects was something that was seen as infringing upon the kind of the male sphere of education, that it wasn't something that subjects that women should be studying. But this is something that was taught at Bedford New College, and Sarah Parker Remond herself was studying. Now, the note that's at the bottom left on this record reads, "These classes were found to be quite unsuitable owing to the particular circumstances and age of the student. Now there's a couple of interpretations you can maybe put on this, and I wouldn't want to say influence you with my own opinion, but there's the optimistic way of reading into this, in that because of her education up to that point, while yes, we know had been limited in some respects, but she clearly had an intellect, she clearly had an aptitude, and was clearly very accomplished, that it could well be that once she enrolled, which she would have enrolled in her very early 30s, she was probably too advanced for some of these subjects at this point, or they weren't adding to her education. And the fact that in the second year, she then only studies history, English literature and French, may suggest then that there was the focus and need on some areas that she felt were the areas that she did want to improve on most. The other areas she was probably perhaps more accomplished with. It's also notable as well that if I refer back to the one quote where she was talking about reading everything and like Oliver Twist, she hungered for more, in a lot of her writing, in a lot of her speeches, you'll find a lot of literary references within there as well. They'll find references to Shakespeare quite often, where she for herself draws parallels with the treatment of Shylock and Jews within within Merchant of Venice and other Shakespearean texts, to the certain prejudices then that black people face within society as well. And there's a very deliberate attempt by her to showcase her intellect within her speeches and how she does present herself. If I go back again as well, because I did skip a couple of slides of a couple of quotes that I do want to share with you around this. In Sarah Parker Remond here, and she said this first quote in an address to the International Congress of Charities, Correction and Philanthropy, and this is in 1862, was that the real capacities of the Negro race have never been thoroughly tested, and until they are placed in a position to be influenced by the civilizing influences which surround free men, it is really unjust to apply to them the same test, as if fair opportunity had been given to develop their faculties. And this again, in terms of the interpretation or understanding of this, kind of draws from perhaps her earlier experiences where she was denied access to this education, and perhaps then you might infer that she encountered certain prejudice around that, or the accusation that for herself or other coloured people weren't intellectual or educationally developed. The fact that she's arguing here they weren't given fair access to it means that it's an unfair judgment to put upon them. And again, for herself, where you can see within some of her talks where she's talking about equal access for education, you can show how her earlier experiences are informing, have influenced her throughout her life. In this letter here at the bottom now, this actually shows how being enrolled at Bedford College did actually elevate her in some respects, or put her in a higher regard from certain people, and especially the UK press as well. This here was a letter from Hill and Chapman to Sir Samuel Cunard, who Sir Samuel Cunard was an owner of a steamer that used to do Atlantic crossings, and in an instance a couple of Sarah Parker Remond's friends were refused access to the suites that they'd booked based on the colour of their skin. Sarah had then spoken about a number of events and written letters that were published in the press about it, and it was mentioned then in this further letter that it only remains to say that some weeks since Miss Remond, a highly intelligent and most estimable person now studying at the College for Ladies in Bedford Square, requests us to take such measures as should be necessary for preventing a reoccurrence of such disgraceful injustice. And we can see here by, if I use the quote again that Sarah says have a good English education, does elevate her standing. It does enhance her reputation. The way that she's then talked about and perceived is enhanced because of now having access to this education. This does link back then to the first quote on this page of saying, well, it's unfair to judge someone if they've not had that fair and equal opportunity as others. But now that she is getting it, we can suddenly see now how she is considered better within other people's eyes. Stepping off from this now, and this is where she goes into a UK speaking tour, that when she does arrive in the UK initially, she does do quite a lot of speaking, but then also during her time at Bedford New College as well, she does during the holidays or at out of teaching hours in London itself, attend speeches, deliver speeches and be part of again, the abolitionist movement, trying to raise funds, trying to raise awareness. Now, these talks were incredibly well attended, almost from the off. And this is, again, for a couple of reasons, as what Selene has talked about, as in, first of all, the reputation that she brought with her from America, but also this novelty of a coloured woman speaking on the subject. And this does attract crowds. And one of the things that she does say, and what she talks about, is that no words can express the mental suffering we are obliged to bear because we happen to have a dark complexion. No language can give one an idea of the spirit of prejudice which exists in the States. And it's interesting at this point within this quote that she's referring specifically to America and the prejudice that she's faced there, because there's a quote I'll share with you later on that kind of typifies perhaps her experience of what she encountered in the UK. And there's an interesting word that she says, there's no language can give one idea of the spirit of prejudice which exists. And it's this, again, this whole idea of what she was talking about, what she was saying, that words and what she was saying didn't encapsulate the true horrors of slavery, that yes, she was there talking about it, but for the audience, they'd obviously never experienced it, and the words wouldn't do it justice. The press coverage itself was very, very favourable. Again, interestingly, in terms of going back to, again, how she was brought up and this idea of how she presented herself as a woman and her femininity and leveraging that, very often she was described and praised because of her conventional womanly attributes and ladylike behaviour. And that's again a quote from a particular news report. This one here from the Warrington Post from the 29th of January 1859 says described as one of the best female lecturers. Her gentle, easy manner combined with an animated, intelligent countenance captivated the audience. And there's similar kind of praise that can be seen through a number of other reports as well. From the Birmingham Daily Post, the lecture, eloquent and powerful as it was, drew forth loud applause. Miss S.P. Remond, whose appearance at the table in front of the platform was hailed with loud and repeated plaudits. And we can see from the Times here that she's going on this speaking tour. The press coverage is good. She's received well. The speeches are well attended. And from this, she is very successful. This is again reflective on kind of like her early life and the opinions she's gathered, the morals she's presenting, how she's presenting herself as a speaker is resonating with the audience. Now, the interesting thing as well is that she wasn't afraid to speak on some very taboo subjects for the time. And it's this kind of, again, a bit of a juxtaposition, as in the press are praising her for how she presents herself as in a womanly-like manner, a ladylike behaviour. But actually a number of the topics that she's talking about were considered very taboo and not really addressed at the time. One of the things that she's one of the first people to do is address the sexual exploitation of women slaves in particular. This from a speech here says, in the open marketplace, women are exposed for sale, their persons not always covered, and are subjected to the most shameful indignities. The more Anglo-Saxon blood that mingles with the blood of the slave, the more gold is poured out when the auctioneer has a woman for sale, because they are sold as concubines for white Americans. This is very likely, from Sarah's own speaking tour, the first time that a UK audience is hearing this and being made aware of it. And it is shocking, and a lot of the press reports reflect this as well, as in like these horrors of slavery that perhaps they ignored, didn't want to address, but were now being confronted with by a woman of colour talking about this very topic. We can see here from a number of press cuttings here, which I've lifted some of the previous quotes from, just actually some of the people as well that attended. And again, this whole idea that she was touring a whole range of different audiences at this point and reaching a whole range of different people. She was in Dublin, Edinburgh. She went to Lancashire quite a lot, especially during the Civil War as well. Birmingham, as we saw, Brighton, a whole number of places, touring extensively. From the reports here, and I don't know how well you can see it within it, but you had people such as the Lord Mayor would attend, and quite often within the reports you'd have a list of notable dignitaries and honourable people within the local community who had attended. in order then to kind of reflect her reputation as a speaker, but also the importance of the talk as well. So there's this whole kind of like a building of her reputation. The people that she's speaking to, the people that she's going to meet and be involved with, really are people who are very well connected within society. And this is something that she perhaps wasn't afforded back in America, that we've said before about the segregation that she experienced here. But here she's welcomed into these rooms, she's well received. And there's again this contrast to perhaps what her thoughts or opinions might have been coming into this, where she was worried about the prejudice that she might receive, which, well, I'm not going to say that she didn't encounter prejudice. In fact, there's a anecdote I'll relate in a bit where it shows she was, but for the most part of actually how well received she was. And this is a quote as well from a speech that she gave in Warrington that I referred to earlier, which does actually kind of reflect this. And she said, "I have been received here as a sister by white women for the first time in my life. I have been removed from the degradation which overhangs all persons of my complexion. I have received a sympathy I was never offered before." And this is something as well that comes through in her own self-titled essay, Remond, of talking about her surprise that when she came to the UK, the different reception she received here and how she was welcomed into society compared to what she was used to in America. And so this really is kind of just showing then this kind of juxtaposition of what she was perhaps expecting to what she did actually encounter. Now there were problems though, there were issues that she did encounter while in the UK. One of the things she actually found was that being a woman, and when she spoke on women's rights, that actually caused her more issues than when she was talking about slavery and issues around abolition. In an instance where she was booked to speak at a particular event by Lord Henry Peter Brougham, he cancelled the event or prevented Sarah from speaking because he was concerned that she would speak on the much vexed question of women's rights, and was concerned that this would be cause for more trouble or problems with the audience than actually the issues of abolition and slavery. And so you've got again this weird issue now, or not a weird issue, but this problem that she's encountering now is not because of the colour of her skin, but actually now her gender and her campaigns now for women's suffrage and equal rights within education. That within UK society, that's where we seem to find this conflict now for her, and where she does now face not a different type of prejudice in America. So the issue of gender did come up, but it was at this point largely about gender where the issue came from. In a talk in Dublin that she gave, they had a male speaker come on after who was an Irish American to authenticate her accounts. And this was done not as because of the colour of her skin, but because of her gender, that by having a man validate her claims, it authenticated them. And that was the type of prejudice she did now encounter in the UK. That there's a real kind of contrast then of her experiences in the US and what she feared coming forward to the problems that she is now encountering in the UK. There is, that I've got on this slide here, then a particular issue that does come to a head in terms of when she tries to apply for a visa to travel to France in November 1859. Now the backstory of this is that when in America she'd applied for a passport by post. With the passports in those times, they didn't have photographs attached to them, and so what you included was a description of the passport holder. Within this, the description that she gave was that she had a dark complexion. That ends up being a bit of a sticking point, as when she applies for a visa at the US Embassy in the UK to travel to France, she is denied so for the reason, first of all, because she is black, but second of all, because they accuse her of fraud with her initial passport application, that as she wrote a person with dark complexion as opposed to African, Negro, coloured or black, they assumed that she'd gained it through fraud. And there's this whole kind of now series of events that occur which end up coming to a bit of a head around Benjamin Moran, the Assistant Secretary of the US Legate. Because what happens is there's a series of letters back and forth where Sarah's arguing that she's born free, she legitimately holds a passport which she's travelled to the UK, she is a US citizen, and so therefore should be afforded the exact same rights as a white person. The response from Moran is that as a person who is of African descent, they cannot be American, and there is a very kind of a grey area within American law at this point that black people who were born free, especially while slavery was still practiced, were seen as either an immigrant or an illegal alien within the state and weren't always afforded the same rights as citizens. And so she falls into this very difficult category of, well, she's got a passport, she's born free, she's paid taxes, and the irony of no taxation without representation, that she's now blocked from travelling. Now the UK press and even the New York Times published transcripts of all the letters back and forth between Sarah and Moran. And the UK press and the New York Times were very supportive of Sarah in this whole problem that she encountered. And we can see from the headlines on the actual issue here, you've got, with a degree of irony laced into it, the headline, "The Land of Liberty." We've got "American Tyranny" and "Disabilities of American Persons of Colour in England." And there's a little bit of a funny layer here, and there's a bit of a wider historical context that we perhaps need to be aware of to appreciate the press's reporting on this. Because yes, they're sympathetic to Sarah, but they're also taking it as this opportunity to criticise America and their whole idea of civil liberties. The UK at the time, since 1815, is operating the West African Squadron. They have abolished slavery, or the owning and trade of slavery within the UK at this point, and so see themselves as having a bit of a moral high ground on this. And so the fact that America still practices slavery and have denied Sarah the visa on her passport, they're taking it now as an opportunity to ridicule America as presenting themselves as the land of the free, when obviously it's patently not true. There's not actually much clarity on how this issue plays out in the end. We know after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 that Sarah was able to travel, but we believe the resolution of this was that she wasn't granted the visa. But this does gain a lot of press attention. There's a lot of discussion around it at some very high levels of society. Writing in his own journal, Benjamin Moran recounts an event where he's at an event attended by Queen Victoria, and he recounts that he saw her looking darkly at him, with, he suspected, the Remond affair dancing in her mind. And so for him, he's aware of the pressure that he's under through this decision he's made, that he believes Queen Victoria herself is aware of it, and he's looking at him darkly at an event that he's attended because of it. And so again, like this whole idea of the kind of prejudices that Sarah does encounter in her life and how she does challenging them, again, we can draw something from this in terms of, from what we were saying, from how she's reflected on her mother in her earlier years, that she didn't shy away from this challenge, this battle. She did challenge it head on. She spoke out against it. She published the letters on it and built up the sympathy and support around it. She wouldn't shy away from the discrimination that she faced. As she said, and as the quote, "It was no crime to be black." This goes now into a bit of a wider context as well, in terms of her speaking tour and the US Civil War that starts in 1861 to 1865. And there's a couple of things that start to affect her speeches in terms of where she goes, but actually the content which she includes within it as well. At the advent of the Civil War, there's an event then occurs that's called the Lancashire Cotton Famine. That Lancashire was very much a textiles industry based region where a huge amount of the cotton was imported from the southern states in America. With the outbreak of the Civil War, southern US cotton suddenly became very, very scarce. This meant that a lot of the mills struggled with business, and you have what was called the Lancashire Cotton Famine. This in terms of a consequence of it, meant that in that area and a number of other industrial areas, there was actually quite a lot of support for the southern states in the US Civil War from a business point of view, that they saw that their livelihoods, their incomes had been impacted and affected by this, and they saw the resolution to that being that the southern states would win, the cotton industry would start again, they could go back to work and get their livelihoods back. People in these areas, such as the factory and business owners, were encouraged to buy cotton bonds from the southern states as well, which were directly then financing the Civil War. And this is like a new context then that Sarah has to step into, because while her audiences have been largely sympathetic to this point, in fact almost universally so, she's now confronted with an audience who aren't necessarily pro-slavery, but they're pro-southern states, and the industry that they're reliant on is reliant on slave labour. And there's a number of things that Sarah kind of does to actually address this, which again kind of shows her attitude of not shying away from prejudice and problems, is that at this period of time, a lot of the talks that she gives are in the Lancashire area and other areas that have been affected by this. She goes into Preston and delivers speeches to working men's groups. There's a phrase as well that comes into her lexicon at this point, and I've got it in the quotation marks here, the term the white slave, something which kind of originates a little bit from certain socialist writings and protests at that point, in that the kind of labour that there was at that point for mill workers was a form of slavery. But what Sarah does is, there's obviously very big differences between the slavery that was practiced in America and other parts of the world to the concept of white slavery in the UK, but she draws upon this concept to these audiences to try and garner an understanding or a sympathy or some common ground between them. And so she draws parallels of the kind of indentured labour or the exploited labour of these people in these situations, and draws parallels to the slavery that existed in America. And I think this is a very deliberate tactic by her to kind of address the concerns of these people suffering under the cotton famine and the impact of their own labour, but to make the abolition of slavery in America relevant to them and to use it. And it's again this idea of how she's able to develop, use her intellect and relate to her audiences to get across her message. Now, there is also as well, coming from this, going through from the Civil War, you get the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, and the Civil War comes to an end in 1865. And it's after this now that it's post-Bedford, she's got her education. There's a number of things now that she does start to do, because the narrative changes. Slavery has been abolished, despite there still being a number of very, very deep prejudices and problems that exist between black and white communities in America. But what does happen with her UK speaking tour is the attendances start to dwindle, they start to go down. And this is where there's perhaps a shift from her moving away from certain messaging to being involved in other aspects as well. Or perhaps taking, as we can see from one of the points on here, that she then retrained as a nurse to explore further education. Now, there's a little bit of confusion over whether she did return to the United States or not briefly after the Emancipation Proclamation. Some of her writings say that she didn't want to return because of the treatment of US black citizens and the failure to protect them, the fact that there was the rise in racist organisations, and along with the involvement of former slave owners within American politics still, which she argued reflected that a black person was still not free in America. However, the historian Joan Johnson Lewis does suggest that she briefly returns to the US at this point, visiting family before coming back to the UK. But what we see as a shift now is more of a focus on women's suffrage issues and involvement in women's education as well. In 1866, she was a signatory on a petition to Parliament requesting the right for votes for women. She was the only black woman who signed it out of 1,500 signatories, and this is a kind of showing now that she's shifting what perhaps she's trying to achieve in her life. She's still addressing the prejudice, the oppression, injustices that she's coming across and encountering in her life, and she's becoming increasingly involved in this. She graduates as a nurse from the University London College. So again, while actually large amounts of education to this point you could argue has been humanities based, she's now kind of changing track with her training and in this sense going into a different vocation. And in 1866 at this point she does now travel to Florence in Italy, and she enrolls, so she's at the age of 42 now, enrolls in the Santa Maria Nuovo, which is a very prestigious training college over there for medicine. Now there's a question that kind of arises at this point of, well, why Italy? Why has Sarah picked to go to Italy at this point? And we believe at this point from the records that she's quite accomplished in speaking French and Italian. So there's a bit of a language where she knows she can go over there. But actually she has had previous interests in Italy and in particular Italian unification as well, that she's encountered through some of the societies and groups and speeches that she's attended on her UK tour. We can perhaps argue as well, and Slanus argues this to a point, that Sarah was of the mindset that you challenge any prejudice or oppression where you see it. That there's a quote that I'll refer to towards the end of the thing which kind of reflects her mindset, as in, yes, she was talking about abolition and the rights of black people, but she saw people as people. There was a human suffering as well that she wanted to address. Through her talks, she did have links with a number of key people. Giuseppe Mazzini, who was quite a prominent revolutionary for Italian unification. I'm going to try and get the pronunciations correct, so I do apologise if I get them wrong, but Baron Piero as well, and Duca di Caballino, as again a number of quite prominent Italian unification revolutionaries. She encounters at her talks, one in Dublin and some again within London. And so she got this association with Italian people, with Italy, with the idea of Italian unification. In a speech in 1861, she drew comparisons between George Washington and Giuseppe Garibaldi, who was the notable Italian general and integral person in the Italian unification. So there is this kind of track record in this history that she's involved in other aspects. She's aware of other issues on the continent and internationally. And there's a whole kind of idea that for Sarah Parker Remond initially, where her origins come from these talks, touring America, talking about abolition, she's evolved and has developed an understanding and an advocacy and support for other movements and aspects as well. She was very well received into Florentine society as well. She had letters introduction from Mazzini and other notable individuals which got her into the higher aspects of society. And at this point you could begin to argue, and this is where Slanus argues as well, that she becomes Sarah Parker Remond the cosmopolitan, is the phrase that comes, that she becomes, more socially involved. She becomes a member of this high society and the kind of trappings and events that are associated with that. However, as I said, she's still enrolled at the Santa Maria Nuovo, and from this she does then qualify as an obstetrician. So again, she's practicing now, she's practicing medicine, she's developed herself further, she's going into new vocations, she's always, as I said, like this whole idea of self-development, self-determination, having this independence for yourself, that there's this track record going through it. And again, this idea that she's cosmopolitan in nature now. There's a couple of reports as well from newspapers and magazines about her entrance into Florentine high society at this point. So from the newspaper Revolution, which was run by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, we have the quote, "It is said her good merits have won her friends on the continent of Europe. Miss Remond is said to be not only well received everywhere in Florence, but she has friends among the very best people there." Also as well, Harper's Bazaar, so the fashion magazine as well, the American fashion magazine, reports on her entrance into Florentine high society. It says, "Another woman, coloured at that, has tussled herself through the little oppositions of common life in Italy, and by studying the requisite demands of the proper scientific people, has been admitted as a practitioner of midwifery in Florence, and her name is Sarah Parker Remond. She has good professional prospects, and she goes among the best people in Florence, notwithstanding her cuticle is tinted. So again, even at this point, you can see in some aspects, and especially from the Harpers, a bit of the kind of prejudicial language coming into it, but this reporting that she's entering into this Florentine level of society. Now, when she's there at the age of 50, she marries, and again, this is a very long name, and I'll do my best with the pronunciation, Lazzaro Tommaso Ufficio Bernardo Pintor, who was from Sardinia. He was a painter and also an office worker in Italy who she meets and then does marry. Interestingly enough, on the marriage license at the age 50, her profession is listed as housewife. So at some point here, we recognise that she had stopped practising medicine when she chose to get married. And there is actually, unfortunately, a bit of a gap in the records at this point in terms of exactly what was going on, what she was doing with her life. We don't know a huge amount of her time here in Italy. Again, there's this whole idea of her being this cosmopolitan, that the kind of inference we draw is because of the circle she moved in when she did practice medicine and midwifery. It was to the higher echelons of society as well. But in this sense, things become a lot quieter in her life. She steps back from the speaking tour. She's not as involved in the kind of advocacy for women's rights. She's more of a socialite in that sense now, and there's a little less on the record in terms of finding out that much about her. Now, we do know, unfortunately, that the 13th of December 1864, sorry, that's 1894 it's supposed to be, I do apologise, in 1894 she does pass away. And interesting, at this point on her death certificate, her profession is listed as surgeon. And so this does again indicate, in this kind of period of time here where we've not got much on the record, that she did go into further study again and retrained within medical practice and was practicing medicine again. So we've got this whole kind of narrative that we've pulled through here, that she doesn't always just sit on a lot. She's always looking for self-improvement. She's always developing, always pushing forward. So going back to very early on, where she talks about her mother saying that everything had to be done properly, everything had to be done right, that you did everything, that you're always developing, you had that independence and self-determination. We can see this through as a thread all the way through her life. From her experiences as well, talking about how she was unable to get fair and equal access to education, her experiences just trying to get into a box at the Opera House, and how that thread's been drawn through where she challenges upfront prejudice that she encounters, again with the issue around the visa on her passport, with an issue as well with a couple of her friends trying to get onto a cabin in a steamliner. She's publishing letters and speaking out about that. She's unafraid to challenge the prejudice where she sees it. And I think as well there's a legacy that comes from this. There's a message that she always promoted, always consistency has, that she challenged this oppression. She didn't want to be prejudged just because of the colour of her skin, and no one should be prejudged on a physical characteristic. You challenge injustice at every opportunity. And I think there's as well that she was clever in how she subverted society's expectations of her. She was aware of the writings around her saying that this novelty of a coloured woman speaking on a subject, but leveraged it to her advantage, that using her femininity and her womanhood then to come across to audiences, to relate to them, to put across her message, and that never accepting that the colour of her skin was a barrier to the liberties, the education or opportunities that she should be afforded. In Rome, in Italy, there is this plaque that exists commemorating Sarah Parker Remond. And also as well, there is a plaque in Salem, Massachusetts as well, along with 5 other notable women that gave a notable contribution to the government and the Commonwealth. And there's a couple of kind of quotes in terms of a legacy that I want us kind of end and reflect on in this sense, that she said here in 1859, "I appeal on behalf of 4 million men, women and children who are chattels in the southern states of America, not because they are identical with my race and colour, though I am proud of that identity, but because they are men and women." And I think this is a brilliant quote for kind of really encapsulating her attitude and mindset towards the prejudices and discrimination that she encountered and saw within society. And I think this as well from Sarah Parker Remond, a coloured lady lecturer, note that she wrote in 1861. She said, "My strongest desire through life has been to be educated." And again, we can see from what she tried to do at age 11, entering into the private school and her expulsion, but through to getting the good English education at Bedford New College, to then training as a nurse at University of London, to then going abroad so she can then train and practice in medicine. There's this whole theme, this idea that you should have this access, this fair, equal access to education to better yourself. And it's that then the quality of your intellect, your substance as a person, that you should then be judged on. So Sarah Parker Remond, 1826 to 1894. Speaking for myself as a librarian here at Royal Holloway and Bedford New College, I'm proud of the association we have with Sarah Parker Remond, the records that we do have in the archives, as well as that link that we do have and the small kind of contribution we're able to make to her story and achievements. I do hope you've enjoyed the talk. I do hope that's been enlightening and interesting.